much for joining me on the show today, Gregg.
Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you something. So you're an expert in how to get people to eat less meat. Why doesn't yelling, go vegan, at people on the street or at dinner tables or at parties work?
There's a few reasons. One is that a lot of people are motivated by not wanting to hear information that's negative about themselves. And so if you start with just a direct appeal to tell people to eat less meat, it's a little bit difficult because it kind of suggests that what they're already doing isn't good, or that for some reason their current behavior is not acceptable. And a lot of people eat meat. So if you're just telling somebody to stop, or that that's wrong, or that's bad, or they should do it less, and they want to maintain this sense of a positive self, they can just kind of ignore that information. And since it's coming from like a small minority of people who are encouraging it, it's really easy to marginalize that group.
Right. So what you're saying is that when we just bring up the negative environmental connotations or ethical connotations about what someone's doing, we're kind of attacking their self-esteem directly. So the first foot we're putting forward is telling someone you're a bad person in a way, which makes them feel bad. So that's like a really bad front foot to be on. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in fact, in the literature and psychology, they call this Dogooder derogation. We don't like people who do good things that we don't do. We get a little defensive about it. And in fact, you don't even have to tell people stop doing it. It's like just by virtue of doing it around them or not doing some behavior around them, they might get a little concerned or be on edge or be on the defensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think people do that a lot, especially, in alcohol consumption. I mean, I come from Australia where people drink a lot of alcohol and I don't drink alcohol. And people seem viscerally offended that I don't drink alcohol around them. And just overall, why is it necessary for us to study psychology to understand how to solve environmental problems?
So I think everybody attempts to be a sort of lay psychologist. Everybody wants to navigate the world and interact with people and have certain interactions go a certain way or convince people to do something differently maybe than they do. And it turns out people are fairly complicated. Just giving them information is often not sufficient, getting them to change their behavior, even when it's a logical course of action. And people can, act aversely when you encourage them to change behavior. Another reason to your prior question on like why meat consumption in particular is difficult is because people in different kinds of behavior choice domains feel a different level of like how much freedom they're entailed for that space. And food is one of the cases where we feel a great deal of sense of freedom. Like we're supposed to be people in charge of deciding what we eat. Other people aren't supposed to tell us what to do there. So if I like tell somebody like, oh, I don't think it's a good idea to eat that, it sort of infringes on their sense of freedom and their sense of personal choice in that space. They want to act in some way to reestablish that freedom, and so they'll disobey.
That's really interesting. So you did a report on studying norms of behavior in respect to trying to get people to eat less meat. Can you discuss what the concept of norms is?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people use that word colloquially to mean things that are popular. And that's part of the understanding we have of it in psychology, but it goes a little bit further than that. In psychology, when we say a social norm, what we're referring to could either be descriptive information about a social norm, like information about what's prevalent or what's common or what most people do, or it could be prescriptive information about a social norm, which would be information about what people think is right or wrong, people think is good, what people think is valuable, or people think is not valuable. And so when we discuss norms, we're often discussing them from either one of those two standpoints.
I just want to go through the detail of the language, because when I'm reading the reports about social norms and literature on behavioral psychology, I find all these terms really confusing. So I thought it would be good for the audience and myself to just get it really clear. So we've got normative information, dynamic norms, which is what you focused on in your study, which got a good result. And then you've got descriptive norms and prescriptive or prescriptive norms. Could we start by you explaining what they are and just giving a little example in relation to meat, what those four terms mean?
In the context of meat consumption, a descriptive norm that's a static descriptive norm would be like most people eat meat. So in the United States, the majority of people eat meat. And it's a very obvious signal that we get every time we're in a social setting where people eat meat. So that would be like a static descriptive norm. A static prescriptive norm would be most people think eating meat is just fine. So it's the idea that most people think it's good or that it's healthy or maybe that it's necessary from a nutrition standpoint or something of that sort. There's no ethical problem with it. There's no reason they ought to change. So that would be a static prescriptive norm, what most people think currently. A dynamic descriptive norm would be information such as meat consumption in the United States has gone down by about 12% since 2008. So that's information about the decline in meat consumption over time. And then a prescriptive norm might be, or a prescriptive dynamic norm might be, more and more people are concerned about the levels of meat they're eating and are starting to reduce. So that's information about their value judgment of that norm changing over time.
So we've got the objective information, like 30%, which is from your study, 30% of people eat meat. Then we've got the attitudes of what you should do, which is kind of our cultural opinion of what is right. And then we've got the change over time. And we can communicate in these different ways. And what did you find from your report when you used dynamic norms, which was change over time? How meat consumption is changing over time. What did you discover?
So what we found is that when people learned about the trends over time, they were much more likely to reduce their meat consumption and express greater interest in curbing how much meat they ate. Now, part of the reason this was helpful was that typically the norm situation for meat consumption is really bad. The reason that we looked at this area is because most of the norm information you would get typically about meat consumption is that most people eat meat. Most people think it's fine to eat meat. When you go into restaurants, it's like the default on menu. Basically, like in every social signaling context, you just get reinforced the idea that meat consumption is just fine and everyone does it. So from that standpoint, given this is a very salient norm and people are reminded about this information constantly, it should be a really hard behavior to change from our standpoint as social psychologists, our understanding of what motivates behavior. We were curious, like, no one's looked at how information about norms changing over time could be a source of influence. And so we labeled that dynamic norms for this study and this line of research. And what we found is that when you highlight the fact that it is decreasing, then you get these positive changes.
Right. And how big was the difference when you used a dynamic norm, which is, everyone's following along, telling people how people are changing in their meat consumption over time?
So specifically, we did this in a few different studies. I'll talk about the one that addressed behavior because that's probably the most interesting one. We compared statements about information where people learned that 30% of people currently make some effort to eat less meat than they otherwise might. So like a static norm about the number of people who currently make some effort to eat less meat. And then we compared that to people who received a dynamic norm, information that there had been an increase and that 30% of people had started to make this effort to eat less meat over time. And when people got that dynamic norm message, they were about twice as likely to go on to get a meatless lunch when they ordered food at a cafe where we were doing this study. So the original baseline was about 17% of people. So it jumped from 17 to 34%. About 1 in 6 people getting a vegetarian entree that day to about 1 in 3 people getting a vegetarian entree that day.
Wow, so that's like doubling the effect of a message just by this slight change in wording.
Yes, and the static norm message has no effect. It's like the same as the control group, where people don't get any information whatsoever.
Oh, really? So the initial 17% wasn't 17% up from zero, it was no change?
That was, pretty much the same as the control group. In terms of some people just get vegetarian entrees. You don't have to persuade everybody all the time. Some people just do it. Yeah.
All right. So when you're just telling people this is what some people do, what if the message says something like 80% of people are eating less meat? Does it being a majority versus a minority? Do you think that would make a difference?
Yeah, and this is like sort of the classic research on social norms, which shows that the more people who do something, the more influential it becomes. And so higher numbers are generally going to persuade more people to do it. And when you tell them that a small percent of people do it, they're likely to actually do the opposite thing.
So if you say to people only 3% of people are eating less meat, then that's probably going to have a negative effect. I actually did a screen grab of this. I might just read it out so everyone knows the exact phrasing, because I think that's the key thing to take away from this. So what it says in the static norm, which had, as you said, no effect on the control, it said, recent research has shown that 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat consumption. That means 3 in 10 people eat less meat than they otherwise would. So this had no effect. And then when you change the wording to a dynamic norm, this is the one that did work, which, as you said, got double the effect. Recent research has shown that in the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have now started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption. That means that in recent years, 3 in 10 people have changed their behaviour and begun to eat less meat than they otherwise would. So if you're listening closely, you should be able to hear the difference in wording in those two different examples. I mean, this is why I just think environmental psychology is so fascinating, because if there's a city or an NGO or a social change startup or even an advertising companies often work in social change missions. There can be large amounts of money put into billboards, put into commercials, into campaigns. It could be millions of dollars that are really shortchanging their effect or having no effect at all by just not being aware of this information.
There's sort of this classic mistake that a lot of people who are trying to help change behavior often do for social problems, where they want to convince people that this is a big problem, So the first piece of information they share is like how many people do some bad thing.
Right.
So like most people don't recycle, and they like want to convey to you that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and here's the scale of it. A recent one of these was for a food waste campaign. I saw an ad that said like 40% of people, or 40% of all food in the United States gets wasted. But what that does is it signals to people that like most people think it's fine to waste 40% of food. So it can sometimes have these like adverse effects that are intended, even though it's trying just to show you the scale of the problem. And so we think it's really important to also, for those kinds of messages, attach some information about change. It's not just enough to show people that there's a problem or that most people don't do a good thing. In fact, that probably hurts your campaign a little bit. Instead, what you want to do is convey that like people are changing, that the direction of change over time is getting better. And in the future, the norms will be different.
Yeah, I read that as well in Doug Mackenzie Moore's book. He has examples of where environmental organizations have made campaigns saying, all these people are littering, and then it just creates more littering. And there's this study about, the one about the rocks in like the petrified rocks that says all these people are stealing rocks, and it just causes people to steal more rocks.
It's a really easy mistake to make because it seems so intuitive, like, oh, I want to show people how big of a problem this is. But then accidentally what you're conveying is that like maybe nobody cares, maybe it's not policed very well, maybe like all these kinds of things are suddenly signaled by having that normative status that usually gives something a boost.
Well, what all this information tells to me is just how unconsciously driven we are by herd behavior. That I think even without our conscious mind engaging, we somehow seem to just want to do what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, there's sort of a continuum of how conscious or unconscious our response to social norm information is. So some cases are just like mimicry. We don't even think about it. And like maybe I'm making the same gestures that you are in this video or something like that. And I'm not aware of it or something. And then at the same time, there's also like a very cognitive aspect to norms, which is that we just kind of give something benefit of the doubt when it's normative. We start to think like, oh, it must be the norm for some reason. And then we actually start to imagine the reasons why. And in our context for dynamic norms, we don't think it's like a mimicry thing. We found two sort of mechanisms that accounted for most of the effect that we saw in our studies. One was that people presumed that if other people had changed their behavior, they like started to eat less meat and they didn't do it before, that behavior change isn't very easy. And so these people must have thought it was actually kind of an important thing to do. And because of that sense that other people considered it important, they themselves might have thought it was also quite important to do. And another reason was that people thought like, oh, like in the future, it's possible that most people won't eat that much meat. So they kind of pictured the future being slightly different. And this also indicated to us who was more likely to find that message persuasive or not persuasive.
And it seems from when I read the two phrases, I definitely instantly felt more excited by the second phrase, that by this sense that, oh, there's this movement happening and there's all these people doing this thing, which I think you can extrapolate into a bigger way of the way anyone would creatively communicate, which is rather than say, all these terrible things are happening in the world, we have to stop them, to say, hey, everybody, there's this incredible movement building up, all these people are doing these fantastic things, whatever it is that's your cause, to kind of inspire people to be a part of this growing trend. I sort of felt jazzed by that wording.
Yeah, there's an effect there, right? I mean, I think at the end of the paper, we quote the kind of famous Margaret Mead quote, right? That when, that all changes really do come from a small group of people who begin to make change. But it's not always clear why. Like there's plenty of cases where a small group of people try really hard and nothing seems to come of it. And then other times there's a small group of people and they do something and then eventually it kind of catches on and it really gets the whole process started for creating social change. And we think that social influence might be one of the factors that determines like if something is going to catch on or if it's going to kind of only be a small number of people. So to the extent that you can persuade somebody that in the future this is how it will be, and look at all these people changing, they must think it's rather important, you're going to be much more likely to have some social change sort of catalyze from a small group to a larger group.
And when you see that tipping point curve, the bell curve of the it's either called the tipping point or the technology adaptation life cycle, that you get innovators changing and then those people influence the next sort of group of people who are the early adopters, and those people influence the next. I think when you see that, you can see how small groups of active people can eventually kick things along. Or that I think that every movement that's ever happened has also been through that cycle, right? Like all the things that we enjoy now as norms were once not norms, right?
Right. Yeah, many things do change. From like the prior understanding of norms, like kind of like before this paper, people, like we had to coin the term dynamic norms. It wasn't a form of information people discussed or thought about. And from like a strict understanding of norms in the past, you would think that social influence only caused people to continue doing what they were doing. That generally speaking, whatever the norm is now should be imbued with the status of being very popular and therefore very persuasive, and that people would just like continue becoming more and more homogenous or more and more similar and following that norm. That would only kind of reinforce the status quo. But the world is characterized by change. We know that many things change. All the norms, as you mentioned a second ago, all the norms that we are aware of are ones that probably weren't the norm at some point in the past. And so I think that dynamic norm information is one way to understand, like, how do these things change over time? What's responsible for those transitions? And part of that answer is just that when we see other people change, it can convey to us a lot of really important information that can help facilitate personal change.
Well, there's always this cycle going on. I don't know, cycle's probably not the best word, but this relationship between wanting to be with the group and also a little bit different to the group. Yeah. Did you hear about the peak beard study? You've got a beard. Maybe you've read it.
No. Is this about, in psychology, we have the phrase ideal distinctiveness.
That sounds like a much more like a legitimate word than peak. Peak beard was just like an article that got like
that works, yeah.
Facebook. But I just think it illustrates. Peak beard is fantastic because it illustrates this concept of wanting to be just with the crowd, but just like a little bit different from the crowd. So it was always considered, or in folklore, that having a beard was like masculine. Or what's the word they use? Virile? Is it the virile? It seems to only ever get associated with beards that I've never heard used in any other conversation. It was just widely considered that it was an objective fact that beards had this effect on women. And at the time that someone did an academic study on this, it was found to be true that they surveyed all the women and found that the women did prefer the men with the beards. Then the study was done once again, maybe it was like 10 or 20 years later. The opposite was found. The women liked the shaved face men. They didn't understand what was going on. Mm-hmm. But then they realized that it was actually what women liked was the novelty of, it was in relationship to what the fashion was at the time, that the women were attracted to that little bit of novelty. So basically, if shaved face is in fashion, having a beard will make you sexier. And if beard is in fashion, then having a clean face will make you sexier. Maybe not that relevant to the whole conversation, but no, it is relevant. It is relevant because when it comes back to dynamic norms, I think there's just always a state of wanting to be with the group, but also wanting to be with those people who are changing. Oh, you're like, oh yeah, people are changing. I want to be on the trend. I want to kind of be on to where the pack is going.
Yeah, people are sensitive to information about norms beyond the here and now. So the fact that they care at all that this information is changing shows us that they care a little bit about what the norm in the future will be, and that people have some imagination for that. And they're sensitive to how this information is, moving around or how these trends are going over time. It's not like a novel statement to say people care about what's in fashion or what's trendy. But I think before understanding about norms would just kind of show you that people kind of conform to what the norm is now. But clearly, there's all kinds of other phenomena going on in the social world. And we're trying to understand how you can kind of capture that and bottle it and use it a little bit for environmental behavior. One of the reasons that we're very excited about this particular phenomena for sustainable behavior is because there are a great many sustainable behaviors that aren't the norm currently. The static norm is bad for them. This is like driving alone, flying, buying stuff, even though you have stuff that already works, eating meat regularly, using lots of electricity and lots of water, et cetera, et cetera. The list is very long of all the things that are currently normative that aren't that great for the environment. If the norms were good, we wouldn't have the environmental catastrophe on our hands that we do. But fortunately, some of these things are getting better over time. In fact, many are. There's a sort of surge in people being less interested in cars, I think. There's this decline in meat consumption in the United States. And in contexts where those norms are improving, if you highlight that information, you can kind of facilitate that change to happen faster.
Right. That's awesome. I'll make a little quote for you that if you highlight the information, you can make the change happen faster. That's really cool. I'm going to read out a quote from your study, which starts to go into this concept of future worlds, which I think is really exciting. And it says, first, when a behavior increases in prevalence, people may anticipate ongoing change and a future world in which that behavior is normative and then conform to the emerging norm as if it were current reality. And we call this preconformity. Can you talk a bit more about this concept of preconformity and this future imaginary world that we can sort of manifest in people's minds?
In our study, one of the things that we measured was if people thought that after reading this information about change, if they thought that change was going to reflect something in the future. And for those people who indicated that they thought in the future more people, that this was going to continue to increase and that more people were going to eat less meat, those were the people who accounted a lot for the effect that we were seeing. So this information about the past change persuaded them that in the future this trend would continue. For those who envisioned that and pictured that future as being changed, they were much more likely, as a result of the intervention we gave to decrease their meat consumption, show greater interest in eating less meat. Yeah, people are sensitive to norm information beyond the here and now, and they're trying to picture what will be the norm in the future, and they're concerned with it in the same way that, like, if you want to, I don't know, catch a ball or something, you have to picture where it's going to go to catch it. If people want to kind of stay on top of what's popular or what's considered good or kind of matching norms, they have to kind of envision the direction they're going as they choose their behaviors in their day-to-day lives.
And you also mentioned in your report that even the effects of science fiction or having visualizations or images of a future world can be so powerful, this imagination of this future world, that it affects our lives now. I mean, what brought you to add that into your discussion?
Part of it was just to convey the idea that people do care about information. It's not just present information. And people are influenced by these sources of things where they would imagine what a norm could be in the future. So some of the past research we cited to suggest that idea was probably possible were things about how the media influences us, or even fictional stories influence us. And we take all that information in almost as though it was a current reality. And we show the same kinds of patterns of conforming to norms or being influenced by what other people do or think, even if those sources of information weren't about the present or about fact.
I was so excited about it because I've been putting this book together called How to Save the World, which is like a 10-step design process. And the third step that I put in it was, I call it Utopian Visualization, which is to do a creative visualization process of the world that you want to create, which I kind of borrowed from the self-help scene, which is where you want to change something in your life. You know, you want a house, you like cut out pictures and make a big vision board of the dream house. Mm-hmm. And I thought about the environmental movement, and I thought I almost never see this done. Like, it's extremely rare to see. What would a meat-free world look like? How would it work? What about a trash-free world? You get some kind of academic studies about a complete carbon-free world coming out. You don't necessarily see it completely fleshed out in something that you can look at and feel and hear and really see that. But I thought that it's so prevalent in the self-help movement. I thought it was really exciting to do the same thing for social change. And I just found when I started thinking that way, it completely opened up my optimism and creativity. And my excitement for working in sustainability just went up by 100-fold every time I would get into that headspace. So what do you think we can, just sort of drawing from that idea of these imaginary worlds, I mean, what do you think we can do more practically to help people get into that headspace of the future world that we could have, and start thinking more that way so we can sort of extrapolate that back to our behavior now?
I think that the way that we think about the present, like whether or not we think other things are possible, is like a huge influence on what we attempt. And so to the extent that people can picture a viable world where some of these things are currently normative or changed, it should be easier for them to picture themselves changing or consider that viable. So I think it's incredibly important for researchers to put out papers showing, like, if we wanted to move to an entirely decarbonized energy production system, here's how it would look. This is what we'd have to do. These are the changes we'd have to make. If for no other reason, just to show that it would be possible. Like, in a lot of cases, these things aren't possible because of what we consider to be politically possible or politically impossible or socially possible or socially impossible. So, for instance, like if we say, like, picture a world where people don't eat meat, it might seem really crazy to us. It might seem kind of like socially impossible. The more that someone can actually kind of envision that, the more that they might be influenced by that image. And another way to kind of understand the influence of norms is to sort of picture a radically different world than if you lived in it and what that would be like. Like, if you grew up in a world where no one had ever eaten meat, like, just wasn't a thing people did. All dishes were plant-based, all sources of protein were plant-based, etc. And then you were walking down the street and you saw somebody like kill a chicken and put a stick through it and put it on a fire and start eating it. It'd be like this insane thing. Like, it would be like this phenomena that we wouldn't understand. And you look at that person, why would they just do that? And you know, I think this kind of shows us like how much we're kind of influenced by it.
Yeah, like if someone did that to a dog, people would go crazy, right? Yeah, it's not that different to the now. Yeah.
Right. There's certainly reasons why people eat what they eat currently. There's like long historical trends and things like that. But a large part of it just comes from the fact that it has current normative status. And so when we can envision other worlds, we can picture these things changing, that might enable us to feel much more confident going forwards and changing our own behavior. But I think there is sort of a dare to dream aspect here, where you need people to be able and open to envisioning the kinds of changes they'd like to see. Which doesn't seem that radical to say, like, oh, try picturing the things that you would like to see different and then imagine that world, and that might be helpful. But for a lot of people, we're very fixated on the current problems we have, and if they're easy to fix, they probably wouldn't be here still. So we get really attuned or really familiar just thinking about them as being static aspects of the environment we're in.
I think this visualization, this, as you say, dare to dream, is radical, because I don't see it really done anywhere. And I started in a few interviews I've done for the book. I ask organizations, have you ever done this before? Or do you have like a plan for like what the future would be when deforestation is solved? And people who full-time work is, working in NGOs or governments, they kind of awkwardly say, actually, I've never thought of it before. We've never thought about it. We've never had a meeting for it. So I think we are very entrenched in thinking of the problems, because historically sustainability has been a problems-driven movement. But where we are now, I think we really need to catalyze our imaginations into, what sort of world do we want to have? And put our mind, rather than always be looking at the last rainforest that was cut down, think of where do we want to be in 200, 500 years, and let's kind of reverse engineer back to now. But it was cool with your report, because it was the first time I'd seen the academic connection to this thing that I intuitively felt was a really good idea. I didn't really have any evidence to back it up.
Oh, good. Yeah. There's not a ton of work on that topic that I'm familiar with, but I definitely share that intuition. I mean, I think part of that is because it just feels risky. It feels scary to picture things being good, because you're forced to create I think people are just generally scared to say what they consider to be a really good thing in a lot of contexts, because it opens them up for mockery, or it shows that they value something, and then someone come along and point out what's wrong with it. And, people feel attached to those things and then feel a little harmed when that happens. The idea, or the phrase dare to dream, kind of captures that notion that there's something audacious about being willing to say, I think this is actually really good, and I think it would be great if we did this instead, because it just puts you in a vulnerable situation to do that.
Yeah, but in the positive, I mean, we started our conversation with saying that when you approach someone telling them what they're doing is bad, that really puts them off or sort of stabs to the core of their self-identity. The dare to dream style of communication doesn't do that at all. It just says, hey, this is where everything is going. That's great. Jump on board with us.
Yeah.
It approaches people from a really different perspective in relation to themselves.
It's still easy, though, for it to slip into it being a prescriptive message. I think a lot of the ways that we think about how to curb behavior change is often maybe unduly centered on prescriptive messages about what people should not do, or what they should do instead. In our study, we really had to sort of bend over backwards to avoid that kind of language. For instance, in the study I mentioned on dietary change, we did this in a cafe. And in that cafe, there's a menu stand and there's a line during lunch. It's usually about 5 minutes long. And we gave people a 2-minute survey that they could complete while they were in line. What we did when we advertised the studies, we said, we're doing research on consumer behavior. We didn't want to tell them that we're researchers who want to persuade people to eat less meat. That would be a no-go from the start. People don't like to be persuaded about food choice. So that was just whatever information you give them. So we told them, we're doing research on consumer behavior and consumer trends. If you could complete the survey, you get $5 off lunch and a coupon. And so people were really excited about that because they were in line anyways. There's no reason not to. Many people participated. And then in that survey, they got that information we talked about before, where they learned about the dynamic norm about meat consumption for the people in that condition. And we didn't tell them that this was good or this was bad or that they ought to do this too. We just said, hey, we've noticed this trend. Why do you think that is? And we solicited them for their thoughts about that. And so got them to think about it a little bit and why people might be changing that behavior and what that change meant. And then we said, great, thanks. Here's a discount on lunch. Have a great day. And then unbeknownst to them, the coupon had a trackable coupon ID number. When later they bought lunch, we could actually correspond it to the order they made and code up if they ordered meat or not. We really didn't want people to think that we were some agency that was in charge or tasked with getting them to change their behavior and eat less meat. We really wanted to make sure that we seemed like people who were just delivering this information, asking people their thoughts about it. It's not so obvious that you can always use this in context to persuade people just by like putting it up on a billboard or something like that. There's a little more nuance there. The other study in the package, which I think helps elaborate this message, is the one on water conservation. And in that one, we were trying to, in the graduate student housing here at Stanford, laundry's free. So if you do one load of laundry with all of your laundry mixed together in it, that load will be free and it'll use about 14 gallons of water, because we have these side-loading washers that are like fairly efficient. Now, if you take that load and split it into lights, darks, gyms, towels, delicates, whatever, right? Suddenly you have all these loads. It costs you the same, costs you nothing, but it consumes like, however many loads it is, 6 times 14, because they use the same amount of water no matter how many loads you do. And so the campus really wanted to curb this behavior. And here we actually did use dynamic norms as a prescriptive appeal. We told people that we had a static norm condition, said most people use full loads of laundry, help Stanford conserve water. And this is sort of during the peak of the drought. It was in the summer of 2014. So there's a lot of drought messaging going on. People knew all about this and knew that they kind of understood that currently most people care about this a lot. So here we think the static norm should help because we're telling people most people care about this. Most people are doing full loads. Help us conserve water by doing full loads. And they had signs, and they had little stickers on the machines to tell you if it was a full load or not, to make it even simpler. And then we had a control group where we didn't do anything. And then we had a dynamic norm group. Here what we were testing essentially was, is it better to learn the majority does something or to learn that a growing majority does something? And so what we did was we just said a majority of students have changed and now they use full loads. Help us help us conserve water by doing full loads of laundry. So it was the same message. It was either most people do full loads or most people have changed and now do full loads. That was the change in the text. In that study, what we saw was we just remind people that it's the norm. Most people do it. We got this boost. 10% of all laundry use was reduced by having that sign up. Whereas when we put up the message that other people had changed in order to do this, we saw a threefold impact. We saw about 30% of decrease in loads used.
30% is really enormous. I interviewed the company WaterSmart. Do you know them?
Yeah.
The product manager there, and their whole system of sending reports, I mean, they get 5%. I mean, maybe it's a bit different with the campus, but...
Yeah, this was like we use a specific norm about a specific behavior, right? We really targeted something, and we delivered the message right when you choose, like if you're going to do all your loads of laundry in one, or if you're going to spread it out over many. And so, we kind of maximized here in terms of like getting the right message at the right time.
It's just fascinating, like just how many more fold increase or change you can get by just starting to understand these concepts and just changing a few words. It's crazy. In the vegan and vegetarian, let's call it the activist world, or all of the activist world, we could say, there's a sense of what I would think would be conspiratorial thinking, a new word I've learned, a kind of conspiracy thinking.
Okay.
Which is thinking that everything is because the meat industry lobbies the government, or because of capitalism, or because of greed. Do you think that people eat too much meat because of all of these things? And what do you think about that type of conspiracy thinking? Maybe that's a strong word to use, but that type of thinking affecting the way we go about change?
There's a lot of reasons people eat meat. I mean, many are structural and do have to do with forms of economy and things like that. So for instance, there's no denying that the USDA has a lot of money come in to favor agriculture industries, which disproportionately make meat a lot cheaper than it ought to be if it wasn't subsidized. So, we subsidize corn with like a ton of money in the United States because it's our cash crop. And that makes corn syrup, cornstarch, and things that eat those two things a lot cheaper, or cornmeal, which is used to feed animals. So there's a lot of reasons why meat is really predominant. Part of it has to do with the markets and industries and stakeholders in that space. But a large part of it also has to do with the fact that people grow up in a world where most people eat meat most of the time, and it's the default item. In some parts of the US, people use the word meat and food synonymously. It's understood to be the meat of something is like the hearty part of it, or the central part of it. All of our food culture is very meat centered in all kinds of ways. All of our holidays, our traditions. A lot of people, when they think of sort of the archetypal meal, picture something with like meat as like the centerpiece of it. And so that sort of like meat-centered aspect of our norms is like conveyed and sort of recreated with every generation. That's an enormous influence beyond the sort of structural influence.
So what you're saying is that it's really just the habitual nature of what is formed in our culture, far more than how much the meat industry is lobbying the government or the price, or perhaps like invisible forces of capitalism. Seems to be a hard sell that I think that we're all just victims of the economy. I don't completely buy that that's the answer to every environmental problem or social problem.
As a researcher, it'd be great to find a way to numerically compare the total impact from like advertising for meat and making meat cheaper artificially to sort of the normative influence, and to a degree inseparable. Like that's why it's also hard for me to kind of parse this a little bit. But I think both are probably very large influences. And for those who feel pessimistic that the agricultural industry or other spaces like that are going to change overnight, there's a lot of work on the cultural side that you can do, a lot of work on the sort of psychological messaging side you can do. I wouldn't advocate only for that, but I think that there's some low-hanging fruit there. that we can take advantage of and get a lot of change.
And one of the big things in getting people to culturally change is the way the behavior reflects on their identity. I've read a whole lot of papers about people have an eco-friendly identity, or they have a tribe that they associate with. Why is identity so important to environmental behaviors, and how can we leverage it? And also, what should we be careful of? I think there's mistakes that we can make when it comes to identity too.
One way to kind of attach this to the norm conversation before is to kind of picture identity as being the hinge that norms operate on. So norms are influential, but not norms about people who are totally dissimilar from you. Like, we really care about norms about people who are like us. In psychology, we consider identity or social identities to be like a main moderator of norm effects. It's like, do they have an effect or not? Kind of depends on if this is a norm about people like me or not. People are motivated to maintain valued identities. So if I care about myself as a Californian, for instance, I grew up in Sacramento. I went to college at undergrad at Berkeley and at grad school now at Stanford. So I lived in Northern California for most of my life, and I kind of identify with the region and its values and a variety of things that I associate with it. If given the opportunity to do some behavior that validates that identity or do some behavior that is understood as being not in line with that identity, I'm likely to kind of go with the ones that are in line with my identity because I want to maintain that identity. And that's how I understand myself as someone who is a Northern Californian, for instance. So in research, we call this identity-based motivation. People want to act in ways that are consistent with their identity and different aspects of the identity they have. For environmental behaviors, there's a little bit of nuance. It always kind of depends on which behavior. But for meat consumption, for instance, men are associated with eating meat. Eating less meat is also associated with being liberal. So less meat is like kind of vaguely associated with being liberal. And we see these patterns in the data we have. And so when people hear normative information about people who do these things, they're trying to figure out like, well, who is that? Like, who are these people who don't eat meat, for instance? One thing that was nice about the findings we had is that the effect of dynamic norms on meat consumption in our research was the same if you were a man or a woman. Like, the effect size was the same. It was the same if you were liberal or conservative, and it was the same if you were young or old. So all these dimensions, which we know normally impact meat, didn't seem to have an adverse effect on the intervention that we had. It was sort of a good signal because it showed that it was sort of robust to different groups and different people. And part of that's because it was about change. It's about people who, like you, didn't make this effort before. So dynamic norms are oftentimes necessarily a little more similar to people like the target audience for the message. But yeah, and for a lot of environmental behaviors, to your other question, which was like, what do we do? What's happening right now that maybe isn't ideal for identity? People are also resistant to changing their identities rapidly. If you approach somebody and you ask them, do you want to be a vegan now? And they weren't before, it's like a huge shift. They don't think of themselves that way. And that is seen as like a no-go. An earlier line of research that I was working on looked at talking about behaviors as either a category or a continuum. So like it's an all or nothing kind of situation, or there's like a more or less space. And people just think about certain behaviors as categories. So some people think about meat consumption as a dichotomy. Like their understanding of eating meat is like people do it or don't do it. And they don't have any sense of there being a middle ground or more or less. And
oh yeah, I'm really passionate about that one.
Oh yeah. And so what we found is when we asked people at the beginning of a survey, do you eat meat? And then we either gave them a yes or no scale, or we gave them a scale that had out of 21 meals in the week, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 7 days a week, out of that 21, how many have meat? And people, it's often lunch and dinner, but not breakfast, right? So it's about 13, 14, something like that. And then at the end of the survey, we asked people the same question. Could you imagine eating less meat? Which was just like, that's like such a low bar, right? It's just like, could you find a morsel of meat less?
You're not even asking them to do it. You're just asking them to think of it. Yeah.
Could you imagine it?
Yeah.
Right? But if we asked them, do you eat meat? Yes, no. At the beginning, like the numbers reduced a lot. It was only like, I don't remember the numbers, not so long ago, but like the effect was like halved. Like the number of people who said like, yeah, would consider it. So if you like talk about meat consumption as a category of like yes and no, people who currently are in the I eat meat category, they're very unreceptive. If you present it as a continuum, they're able to warm up to it more. This is only one aspect of this situation, right? Like it's only looking at like what works as a foot in the door. This is not to say anything about like which of these is more ethical or less ethical or anything more complicated than that. But just in terms of like how people respond to these different messages, for a lot of people, thinking about meat consumption as a category just makes it like it makes the ask seem too big, and it just seems like an identity clash with who they consider themselves to be.
I'm so glad that you answered that and you know it, because you've basically just answered my next question. Well, maybe not completely, but is that do you think the words of vegan and vegetarian, these words that we've come up with, are helpful or are they divisive or unhelpful?
So the other thing that makes this complicated is that for those who do the behavior that you're trying to persuade, having an identity around it makes them do it more consistently. If you're vegan or vegetarian, and that's an identity you have, then you want to maintain it, especially if you like it. I mean, you want to maintain it. And so people in those scenarios that think about meat consumption categorically and have the identity are much more likely to stick to it. So in that scenario, it's great to have these terms. For people who aren't doing it yet, it doesn't help. It just makes this thing, you understand it suddenly as like, oh, I'm not a vegetarian. So when I go to a restaurant and I see dishes that are called like vegetarian, whatever the dish is, like there's pasta and there's vegetarian pasta. Like, and if I eat meat, then I see that, I go, oh, I'm not a vegetarian, so the vegetarian dish isn't for me. And so that's actually a problem now because I think there was a study from some researchers in the Netherlands that showed that if you just take the word vegetarian off of these items, that like they sell better.
Oh, really? Is that for real? Yeah.
Even though the description is still like just plant, Parmesan, et cetera. Like it's pretty obvious that it's a vegetarian dish if you thought about it, but like removing the label vegetarian like increased how much people ordered them. And we see some similar effects. One line of research we do, we collaborate with like the Reducitarian Foundation, for instance, and we were doing a study where we looked at giving people these appeals. We used dynamic norms again, but here we did it in regards to more people are becoming vegetarian or more people are reducing meat consumption. There's some positive benefit of both, but we see a larger effect when we talk about it. It's like more people are becoming reducitarian or something like that. So that's still a term, but it's a term that's not talking about meat consumption categorically.
Oh, I just find this so fascinating because, I mean, the area is really close to my heart. I mean, I prefer to go by low meat. I don't really like the word vegan or vegetarian, and I don't like the idea of it being attached to, I think the essential problem, I mean, I could be wrong about this. I want to know what you think is that when it's a noun, it's a name of a tribe, it's a name of a complete identity and a way of being. Mm-hmm. I think that's where really it falls apart because you see all these vegan communities on Facebook and they're all arguing about these tiny minutiae. And it's not a small thing to argue about minutiae in the vegan community. It actually takes up a lot of what they talk about. It's like, can I eat honey? What if someone gives me a cheese sandwich that's going to be thrown away? All these conversations start to fill up the universe of the vegan consciousness.
Yeah.
And they even can become ridiculous. Like, is breast milk vegan? And people have these enormous, is eating a placenta vegan, your own placenta? Anyway, all these like crazy conversations. I think if it just changes to a verb, like I ate a vegan meal, I had a vegan diet today, I am currently eating a vegan diet, then it kind of takes that out of it. And I would like to see the movement change to a more of a verb style way of using the word rather than the noun, which makes it this very prickly sort of black and white thing. And for that reason, I don't use those words to self-identify, even though I eat that way 99% of the time. But it's just interesting that you bring up all these studies that show where the words vegan and vegetarian can actually be harmful in this black and white thinking.
No, it's totally the case. And, you know, sometimes there's a tension between being right? So for a lot of people, being vegan is like a moral stance and they consider it like deontologically correct. Like it's just like any alternative would be immoral. And there can be a tension between doing exactly what you think is the right thing and projecting, like communicating to others what you think is morally correct and being persuasive. And so I think people who are in that moment should just think like, which of these things are they trying to do? Are they trying to be persuasive? If they're trying to be persuasive, then you don't want to start with, you do something wrong, let me tell you about it. Because that doesn't work very well. And in terms of like, let's take like a hot or a hard context. So if you're a vegan and you're at a barbecue, like what are you supposed to do? Right? Like, because, you know, a lot of people don't feel like they don't want to perpetuate the norm by participating in it. And yet we know that people who are considered moral do-gooders are going to be denigrated, and maybe the causes they stand for become even more negatively associated than they were before, perhaps. It's a possibility, depending on how they handle it. And so in those moments, you know, it's very difficult to understand what one should do. There's a tension between like doing what one considers moral and what could be more persuasive. It might be a good idea for people to feign the things that they care about most in certain moments when it's like not a good moment to pick that battle because you think it'll be even less persuasive than had you never talked about it, which is often the case for a lot of things. It doesn't mean you have to partake. It just means that you can say like, oh, it didn't sound good to me. For instance, that might be a strategy that people could employ. And then you wait for the moments where people seem willing or interested to learn more, and you approach them about those things. This is in terms of how to make grounds on a one-by-one basis. It's totally different if you want to, I don't know, make PR for a company look bad or something. That would be a very different strategy. But in terms of just persuading a person in a moment about something, you really want to, if anything, affirm them first. Like tell them like, oh, that looks great or this smells great, but I've been cutting back on like how much meat I'm eating. For instance, you know what I mean? Like you don't want to like insult the dish they made or the effort that they're putting into food they're sharing with you. Like there's all these things happening in that moment that can be offensive. Sort of a minefield kind of moment to navigate from a psychological perspective or social psychological perspective to persuade others.
Yeah, I find that it's so interesting that you brought up that the less meat, well, how did you phrase it? Lower meat, cutting back meat? I know it was another study. You said it was a low meat versus more vegan or something.
Yeah, we compared studies where we gave people an op-ed that they read. In the op-ed, they talked about more people becoming vegetarian or more people reducing how much meat they eat.
Reducing meat,
Yeah.
meat.
And in that study, they used the reducitarian.
Because I feel in my home life, the guy that I live with has radically adopted what he calls a low meat diet. He was already open to it. And then when I moved in, I was like, vegan diet's the way to go. There's no need whatsoever to eat meat. Look, I'll show you how it's done. And he is a intellectual, critical thinking sort of guy. And he says for all objective, factual reasons, eating what he calls a low meat diet completely suits him. And he has never, ever once in 2 years brought an animal product food into the house. But when he goes out for corporate lunches and stuff, I think he eats meat then, but he's been telling me that how much he's lost interest in eating any meat or any animal products when he is out at corporate lunches, etc. And he would never adopt, he's not a vegan type of guy. He would never adopt that sort of kind of cult-like name. But it's just been my own little home petri dish of just watching this behavior come along and just identifying as a low-meat person. And he's really comfortable with identifying as a low-meat person. And he has a fairly conservative type job working in economics and the kind of conservative side of computer programming. I mean, socially conservative, not politically conservative. It would be very weird for him to say he's a vegan in the circles he moves in. But saying I'm a low meat guy totally works. He's completely socially fluid as a low meat person now.
Yeah, so we're really kind of we're talking about kind of like two strategies here for getting people over this hump of having this issue where most people don't identify as vegan or vegetarian. So how can they eat less meat if they don't have that social identity and they don't want it? Or it'd be hard for them given their social circles. How do you navigate that? And the two strategies we're talking about, one is having identities that are sort of like in between. So like some people, what's Bittman's phrase, vegan before 6 is one of these, right? Where it's like, oh, I'll eat meat for dinner, but not during. I won't eat anything else animal-wise for the early part of the day. I always thought it was funny if someone was like a bacon-tarian, like I won't eat meat, but I'll just eat bacon. Like
I've never heard of that one before.
But that one's kind of funny because as a social thing, it works really well because what you're doing is one, it's just humorous, and so like no one's gonna crap on the person who's the bacon-tarian, right? No one's gonna be like, I can't believe you don't eat meat.
Because it's funny, yeah.
Because it kind of acknowledges that like there's something nice or tasty about meat, and so you have this moment of sympathy with this person, even if you eat a lot more meat than they do. So you can't really like object. But really, if you just ate bacon, unless you're going to kill yourself by eating it 3 times a day or something, you're probably not having that much. So you're probably eating very, very little meat if that's the only kind of meat.
Right.
So these sort of intermediate identities is one way to navigate a very polarized space and give people options that feel suitable to who they are and match other aspects of their personality and self and social worlds. Another way to do it is just to avoid categories altogether and just talk about this as a continuum. There's just more and less. People often, when I introduce my work, people ask me like, are you vegan or vegetarian? And like, I don't know what to say to them because I don't like that question kind of like in that context. But I can say technically no, because there's some animal products I consume. I'm certainly not vegan, and I don't eat that much meat, but I will if it's going to get tossed out. So I'm not vegetarian really either. Some people call that flexitarian then, I guess, for what I do. But I haven't found those labels in my case to be especially helpful. I just say like, I try to eat very little meat.
I do the same sort of thing. Yeah, I would say I eat a vegan diet 99% of the time. That's my standard answer, which is a shame that it takes a lot of words, but that's my best phrase so far. Yeah, I am just so excited about this grey area in this vegetarian-vegan debate because I've just had a hunch that this black and white model is not helping. And I think when the debate moves to a grey area continuum model, there'll be potentially a big change. So I'm really excited to see the debate move to this continuum. So it's really exciting to talk to you, and you've got all this knowledge and background in kind of proving this, or more so, proving this intuition. So I had this question about the Amazon Mechanical Turk, which you used to do the study. I've seen it used in lots of other studies before, but I never really knew what it was. And I looked it up, and it's pretty easy to use, right? Is it possible if someone who's working at a city or at an NGO, they're trying to come up with phrasing for a campaign? Can anyone just set up an account and just for a couple of $100 test out their different messages to see which one will work the best?
Yeah, Amazon Mechanical Turk makes running surveys incredibly fast and incredibly cheap. There's a large pool of people that are there, tens of thousands, I think, of people who are listed on this sort of like micro task website. At first, this was used, I think, for marketing. Like people wanted to know like which of these 3 pictures was prettier. They could do focus groups, but they wanted like a larger sample and they wanted to break it down by demographics and do all this kind of stuff with it. And so Amazon made this service where they had all these people do these surveys where it's like a 2-second survey and you get paid like 5 cents or something like that. And people could, by doing a lot of these, actually put together some income, and people who wanted to conduct some research or wanted some marketing data could get it really fast. And at some point, researchers figured out that this was actually a very convenient space to do surveys. You need to have people like drive to your lab on campus and then fill out a pen and paper version of the survey and then code it into a data sheet. You could just like have somebody on the internet fill out your survey very quick. And if the survey is only a couple minutes, maybe you paid them like 25 cents each or something like that, or 35 cents each, whatever pricing you want to kind of mark, maybe close to minimum wage. With a few $100s, you can get like 300 people to take a survey. You could probably get maybe like 1,000 people to take a survey with a few $100s. It's quite cheap. It kind of depends how long the survey is, obviously. It's a huge advancement for a lot of social sciences, because before we had to rely on samples that were local to the institution we were at, and now you can get a national sample. Amazon Mechanical Turk users aren't representative of the whole country. They tend to be a little bit more liberal. They tend to be younger, and they tend to be more web savvy on average. But you can always ask people for this information in one way or another in like a demographics section of the survey, and then kind of weight the sample towards those who match demographics to be closer to a national sample. So this is like a great way to get like a really quick, like how much people feel about these 3 different versions of this thing I have, which one are they most warm towards, and like see if there's major differences or not.
Yeah, I think if you're planning to do a flyer or a billboard, I mean, cities are often doing this for sustainability. And a lot of the time, I mean, I don't want to say it, but a lot of the time they're pretty terrible. You know, I don't know, they're getting these, I don't know who their graphic designers are, but I mean, I learned graphic design years ago to help solve this, because I was like, oh my God, who designed this? Someone has to fix this. God. But you can at least put it out in front of people and see which one works. I might start using it for some of the stuff I do.
It's quite easy, pretty easy to set up. I use it in conjunction with Qualtrics, which gives me a little bit more options, and I don't have to program too much in terms of, I don't have to like write my own JavaScript or anything like that. You could do everything if you wanted and you knew how to code it in Amazon Mechanical Turk and write your own. But having some survey or connecting it to like SurveyMonkey or something that's like cheap and everyone can use, between like 2 tools like that, you can run your own surveys. And yeah, for a lot of cities that like all they do is ask like 10 people who happen to be in the office that day their opinion about something, this is like a much better thermometer for like how the public is going to react to something. If there's like a debate, like there's like 2 radically different directions people want to take a project, and you want to know how to settle it, just go ask people who are actually going to see it. You can also restrict the sample to like people within a specific state even. So you can get it narrowed down to closer to the audience of who's actually going to see it. But for a lot of things that we do, we tend to use the national sample, because we just kind of want to describe this from like kind of a wider lens.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I looked it up in a bit more detail, because I'll do a sample and I'll try and create a little test of my own with it.
Yeah, and we always start there really. For like pretty much every line of research we have, we start by doing something on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And then if it looks like it does a good job there and has strong effects with like self-report data, then and sometimes we also do like online behaviors. So we can actually see like, aren't people just willing to say in a survey they like this or like that, but like, are they willing to sign up for this? Are they willing to actually go to that website? Are they willing to put their name on a petition? Whatever it is that we're looking at, there's certain behaviors you can do online. And so you can actually get something better than just self-report for a lot of these things. And then we move it to an actual field study, because field studies are much harder to conduct and they're more time intensive and more costly.
I see. So you can sort of do like a little test case or a little like mini feasibility study on the Mechanical Turk before moving to something in the real world. Wow. I'm going to ask you my favorite ending question. Let's say we'll skip ahead 100 years in the future. If there was just one thing that you could have achieved or you could see changed in the world, just one thing that you think would really change everything, what would you choose it to be?
This is going to be such a bad answer. So it's, but like for so many of the things that I'm preoccupied with within environmental behavior, it's really necessary to understand why the problem exists in the first place. Like, why do people consistently choose things that aren't sustainable? If I could change one thing, it'd be to get people to spend more time trying to answer that question before they move on to trying to design a solution. Because so many people, when they want to design a solution for something, they're like, oh, let's reach for they don't really reflect on this. They just kind of do it automatically. Let's tell people that it's bad, or let's give them a reward for doing the good thing. And they just kind of immediately jump to solutions. But if you kind of understand why people do what they do ahead of time, you might be able to move just like the one key component that can flip their behavior. So in this case, we thought norms are like one of the things that makes choosing not to eat meat rather difficult, because people are getting so many signals that it's fine, that it's good, everyone does it, and that's what you're supposed to do, etc. And so we just wanted to take that piece that usually hurts in that context and flip it around and make it something that encouraged people to change their behavior. And that helped us dramatically. So I think if people kind of paused and kind of examined the situation and try to lay out the sort of psychological landscape of why people are doing the behavior that's considered problematic, and then once they understand that, it might be really easy to target the one piece you just need to move to try to get things to go well.
So really getting into the headspace of why is it the way it is before we get on to anything else.
Yeah. And I say that's a bad answer because I'm a psychologist, and so I'm saying think about psychology a lot, which is kind of a cop-out, I think. But
it's not a bad answer. It's a great answer. And the last gentleman I interviewed said something very similar. He said, if we want to solve the problems, we really need to get into the headspace of why people are doing things the way they are, because people who are professional environmental advocates are very intrinsically motivated, and they're really outliers. So you're not going to be able to reflect on why you're motivated, on how you're going to change the other 95% of people. You have to really get into their headspace and their emotional drivers to try and start to work out these problems.
Yeah, and there's so much time and resources spent on these kinds of campaigns, and a lot of them, from like an empirical standpoint, they are kind of operating in the dark. You know, they have an idea about what will change this thing, like how they should phrase that message or what they should do. But like sometimes in the examples that we gave, there's like one or two words different that like makes the effect appear or not appear at all. And so, you know, it's kind of important to try to have some grasp of like what those things are in your particular context.
It's true. And like I said, I mean, I've said it a few times why the field of environmental psychology is just so critical to sustainability. So we can find those hinges that create change. Thank you so much for joining me today, Gregg. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I mean, every person I interview has been absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad to have you on the show. And I hope this has been interesting for the listeners to really think about these details into this concept of norms, this detail in the grey area of trying to get people to eat less meat, about how our identity affects our environmentally sustainable behaviors. It's just been such a thrill to go over this. So you can find this on the YouTube channel, How to Save the World, if you want to watch us talking. And if you're watching on YouTube, check us out on iTunes, same name, How to Save the World. And make sure you sign up to my website, katiepatrick.com. I've got a whole bunch of free resources there about how you can apply design, data visualization, and gamification to your special world-saving cause. So thanks again, Gregg. Thanks for listening. And I hope this has helped turn your dreams for a better world into real and measurable change.